2,800,000 soldiers. That is how many German troops surrendered to the Soviet Union. The shooting stopped in Berlin, but the dying continued in the camps. Why did the killing continue? The war was over, but Stalin's machine demanded retribution. At first glance, a prisoner exchange, but in reality, a death sentence. The winter of 1945 was catastrophic. The cold froze men where they stood. Disease spread through the barracks faster than the guards could bury the bodies. There was no medicine, there was no heat. The camera records, skeletal figures huddled around small fires. Their uniforms are in rags. Labor was the weapon of choice. 16-hour shifts defined the day. In the forests of Siberia, prisoners dragged timber through deep snow until they collapsed. In the mines of the Urals, the air was thick with coal dust. Muscles atrophied, minds broke. It got worse. Hunger stripped away all civilization. Men fought over crusts of bread. They ate vermin to survive. To the Soviet people, these were not victims. They were the invaders, the men responsible for burning villages and destroying cities. The guards watched them die without blinking. They saw only the eternal enemy. The statistics are grim. Between 356,000 and 1 million Germans never left Russia. They fell victim to a systematic vengeance. The books were closed on their lives. June 22nd, 1941. That was the day the clock started ticking for the Third Reich. Operation Barbarossa began, and the German war machine tore into Soviet territory. Tank treads churned up the earth. Infantry moved fast. Their target was the Volga. Their goal was Stalingrad. Why did the Sixth Army collapse? They had superior training and firepower, but geography and winter were stronger than any weapon. German forces reached the city outskirts. They intended to seize control and sever the Soviet Union's vital artery. Soviet forces, however, refused to break. Months of street fighting turned buildings into hollow shells. Then came the counterstroke. In November 1942, the Red Army launched a massive offensive near Kalash. The trap snapped shut. Supply lines were severed instantly. Communication wires went dead. The German soldiers inside the city were no longer conquerors. They were prisoners in an open-air cage. At first glance, a tactical retreat. But in reality, a logistical catastrophe. Conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food reserves vanished. Ammunition ran low. Survival depended entirely on the Luftwaffe's air bridge, but the planes could not land. The extreme cold set in. Snow buried the foxholes. Poor sanitation and overcrowding bred disease. The Sixth Army did not just lose ground, it began to rot from the inside. The footage shows soldiers wrapping rags around their boots to prevent frostbite. Medical stations were overwhelmed. A minor wound became a death sentence. Gangrene and infection killed thousands who might have lived. On February 2, 1943, the end arrived. Generals Konstantin Rokossovsky and Nikolai Voronov sent the report. The German army had been crushed. Military operations ceased. In just 48 hours, 90,000 men surrendered. 40,000 joined the 50,000 captured days earlier. There was no dignity in this surrender. German soldiers stripped the dead. They took coats, gloves, anything to keep warm. Soviet forces herded them into a temporary camp in Beketovka. The camera records, long lines of gray figures shuffling through the white snow. February 3rd. A single Heinkel, He-111 flew over the city. It circled the ruins, searching for a signal, a flare, any sign of escaped soldiers. It carried supplies. But the pilot saw no movement. The city was a graveyard. He turned back. 91,000 German soldiers were now captives of the Red Army. Their ordeal had only just begun. Nazi authorities had made empty promises. The Soviets offered no mercy. Many prisoners were already skeletal, teetering on the edge of death from starvation. They were disarmed. They were stripped of personal belongings. Then the marching began. Columns of prisoners stretched for miles. They walked toward remote villages and railheads. The temperature remained sub-zero. Those who stumbled were not helped up. An escort's bullet ended their struggle in the darkness of the night. The visual evidence is stark. Bodies line the road like frozen markers. Thousands died on the road. Typhus, Dysentery, diphtheria, and scurvy swept through the ranks. Tuberculosis and malaria finished off the weak. There was no medicine, there was no adequate clothing. They marched toward labor camps in Siberia, driven by guards who despised them. It is estimated that only 1/3 of the prisoners survived the first few weeks. The camps claimed the rest. Years passed. When the release orders finally came, the statistics were horrifying. Out of 91,000 men who marched into captivity, only 5,000 returned home. Stalingrad kept the rest, 30 degrees below zero. That was the baseline for survival in the Soviet winter. Why were the Soviet camps so deadly for German prisoners? It seemed like simple neglect, but in reality, it was a systematic machine of revenge. The Soviet Union already possessed a vast infrastructure of misery, the Gulags. Established by the NKVD in the 1930s, these camps were already overflowing before the first German tank crossed the border. They held spies, saboteurs, and thieves. But mostly, they held political prisoners, ordinary citizens accused of anti-Soviet thoughts. Then came the summer of 1941. The invasion began. The Ministry of the Interior scrambled. They established a new directorate specifically to manage enemy prisoners. But there was a problem. The front line was in chaos. Manpower was non-existent. In that first year, the Red Army captured few enemies. The new camps stood empty. Logistics failed. The location of the camps remained a mystery because the battlefield shifted every hour. But this was only the delay before the catastrophe. Stalingrad changed everything. The Red Army didn't just win the battle. They captured an entire army. Suddenly, the system had to swallow hundreds of thousands of men. The Soviets reclaimed the Volga region and immediately began construction. 40 new labor camps rose from the snow around the ruins of Stalingrad. At first glance, temporary detention centers, but in reality, freezing tombs. Conditions deteriorated instantly. Food vanished. Medicine was a myth. Take the camp at Beketova, a former school building shattered by artillery. The windows had no glass. The wind howled through the corridors. The footage shows men huddled on the floor in a solid, trembling mass. They pressed together to share the last scraps of body heat. Pale skin turned black from frostbite. Prisoners tore wood from the door frames. They burned the floorboards just to feel warmth for a few minutes. Rations were lethal. The prisoners received black bread. But it wasn't flour. It was a mixture of grain and sawdust. Sometimes they got a frozen potato. Occasionally, raw beets. Temperatures plummeted. At dawn, the thermometer often read 30 degrees below zero. Disease followed the cold. Diphtheria, muscle atrophy. Typhus swept through the barracks. The camera records, bodies stacked in the courtyard like firewood. The ground was too hard to dig graves, so the guards left the corpses where they fell. The freezing elements preserved the faces of the dead. But the guards did not just walk away. They stripped the bodies first. They took boots. They took coats. They pried gold teeth from frozen jaws. Hunger drove men to madness. Reports from the time confirmed the unthinkable. Cases of cannibalism occurred in the dark corners of the barracks. Theft became the only way to survive another day. The guards found this amusing. In the frame, a Soviet soldier laughing at a starving German. To the guards, this was justice. They remembered the Nazi atrocities on Soviet soil. They saw the German army not as soldiers, but as monsters. This hatred dictated the daily routine. Work was mandatory. Prisoners marched to mines and factories. They rebuilt infrastructure for 12 hours a day. The sound of pickaxes hitting iron-hard earth echoed constantly. Tools were primitive. Weather conditions were ignored. If a prisoner stopped, he was beaten. If he collapsed, he was often left to freeze. Medical resources in the camps were zero. A simple infection became a death sentence. Doctors had no bandages, no drugs, no instruments. They could only watch. Discipline was absolute. Minor infractions led to solitary confinement in unheated cells or a bullet to the back of the head. There was no compassion. The guards viewed the dehumanization of the enemy with satisfaction. The strict regime crushed any will to resist. The frozen earth claimed them all. Summer of 1943. At that moment, heavy crates stamped USA began to arrive in the Soviet rear. It was Lend-Lease aid. Inside were cans of meat, flour, and medicine. For the first time, the Soviet administration distributed basic food supplies to the starving German captives. But for many, this mercy came too late. By the time the crates were pried open, only a few thousand prisoners from the initial waves remained alive. The rest were already buried in shallow pits. Survival was not a matter of luck, it was a matter of rank. The treatment of prisoners followed a strict, ruthless hierarchy. Ordinary enlisted soldiers were thrown into unheated barracks or open fields. They faced typhus, lice, and starvation. Officers, however, lived in a different world. They received rations, they had beds. Consider the camp in Jelabuga, east of Kazan. At first glance, an ancient, peaceful monastery, but in reality, a death trap for the lower ranks. Approximately 1,800 prisoners were packed into the damp stone cells. Disease spread through the corridors. Bodies were carried out daily. By the end, only 1/3 of the inmates walked out alive. But the German generals? They faced a different fate. They were valuable assets. The Soviet command interrogated them, sure, but they also fed them. They were groomed to become propaganda tools, living trophies displayed to the world to prove the Red Army's superiority. This disparity was absolute. A private died in the mud. A general drank tea in a heated room, and the most valuable trophy of all was Friedrich Paulus. His trajectory was a vertical crash, from the commander of the Sixth Army to a prisoner in a Soviet camp. His story reflects the exact moment the war turned against the Third Reich. November 1942, Stalingrad. Paulus stood at the center of the cauldron. His forces pushed toward the southern districts, but the resistance was inhuman. General Vasily Chuikov turned every building into a fortress. The footage shows ruins covered in ice, soldiers huddled in craters, the breath of men freezing in the air. It was not just a battle of bullets, it was a battle against the elements. The German offensive stalled in the rubble. The weather turned brutal. Paulus saw the disaster coming. He had doubted Operation Barbarossa from the very beginning. He was a planner, a man of maps and logistics. He advised cutting off the Soviet retreat early. He begged Hitler to send winter clothing. He warned that the war would drag on. Hitler's response was silence. The Führer forbade any talk of defeat or preparation for a long winter. January 1943. The Sixth Army was surrounded. Why did Paulus hesitate to break out? He had the men, but he was paralyzed by his oath to a leader who had abandoned him. Conditions in the basement headquarters became medieval. No food, no fuel. The screams of the wounded filled the bunker. On January 30th, 1943, a telegram arrived from Berlin. Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal. It was not a reward. It was a suicide order. The message was clear. No German Field Marshal had ever been taken alive. Hitler expected Paulus to put a pistol to his temple and pull the trigger. He wanted a martyr, not a prisoner. But Paulus made a choice. He looked at the weapon, he looked at his staff, and he surrendered. The reaction in Berlin was immediate and vindictive. Hitler flew into a rage. The Gestapo was unleashed. They didn't just target Paulus, they went after his blood. Police agents kicked down the doors of his family home. His sons, Ernst Alexander and Friedrich, were arrested. They were dragged to a high-security prison in the Alps. Their only crime was their father's survival. They remained locked away until 1945. Paulus's wife, Elena Rossetti Solescu, was left isolated, facing a future of uncertainty and shame. Meanwhile, the field marshal boarded a train heading east. He left the ruins of Stalingrad behind. Ahead lay the barbed wire of a Soviet camp. The war for him was over. The punishment had just begun. Minus 30 degrees. That was the temperature awaiting the survivors. The journey into captivity was not a march. It was a slow, freezing crawl. Paulus and his men did not just walk. They stumbled through the snow, wrapped in rags, battling frostbite and starvation. Exhaustion claimed them one by one. But this was only the beginning. The Soviet prison camps were not built for comfort. They were overcrowded, holding pens, the archives record, barracks packed to the ceiling, no heating, no medicine. Food was a luxury. Typhus and dysentery spread through the ranks like wildfire. Men didn't just die, they rotted alive in the filth. Why did the Soviets keep the field marshal alive? It wasn't an act of mercy. It was cold calculation. For the Kremlin, Paulus was not a man. He was a trophy. A high-ranking general in a cage proved the superiority of the Red Army better than any poster. He became a weapon of propaganda. The camera captures the humiliation. In the frame, Paulus sits at press conferences. Flashbulbs pop. Microphones are shoved in his face. He looks gaunt, defeated. Moscow paraded him like a prize beast. They forced him to speak, to denounce the Nazi regime, to break his oath publicly. At first glance, a repentant leader. But in reality, a broken tool used to shatter German morale. Years passed behind barbed wire. 1953. The gates finally opened. Paulus was released after nearly a decade in isolation. But freedom had a bitter taste. Tragedy struck almost immediately. His wife died just 4 years later. He was left alone in a world he no longer recognized. He returned to a Germany that had ceased to exist. The footage shows. Cities turned to rubble. Concrete skeletons where homes once stood. The country was divided. Paulus faced a wall of silence and judgment. His legacy was torn in two. To some, he was the traitor who surrendered. To others, he was the pragmatist who chose life over Hitler's suicide orders. He didn't return to the battlefield. He finished his life at a desk. He served as the civilian head of the Institute for Military Historical Research. But his body began to fail. Progressive bulbar paralysis took his ability to move. He wasted away in a clinic in Dresden. February 1st, 1957. The struggle ended. 18 years old. That was the age of the enemy the German army feared most in the winter of 1941. After the invasion of the Soviet Union, the front lines collapsed. Entire cities surrendered. But behind the Wehrmacht's rear guard, the forests came alive. A massive partisan movement formed to disrupt the occupation. Women played a critical role in this shadow war. Why did they choose the forests over safety? The recruitment offices of the Red Army often turned them away. Officers told them to go home. But the desire to defend their land was stronger than rejection. They didn't just wait. They took up arms. Among them were thousands of young women who traded their futures for rifles. One name stands out in the archives, Zoya Kozmodemyanskaya. She was a high school student from Moscow. In October of 1941, she left her classroom and joined a sabotage unit. There was no training camp luxury. She marched southwest toward Narofominsk. She crossed the front line and vanished into German-occupied territory. The footage from the era shows the conditions, waist-deep snow and temperatures far below freezing. Zoya and her unit did not rest. They mined the supply roads. They cut communication cables in the dead of night. Every severed wire meant a delayed German order. Every mine meant a destroyed truck. The goal was simple: bleed the enemy dry and buy time for the Soviet troops. But this was only the beginning. November 27, 1941. Zoya received a lethal command. Her target was the village of Petrishchevo. Intelligence reported that a German cavalry regiment was using the village as a base. The order was to burn it to the ground. She moved with two other partisans, Boris Kranov and Vasily Klubkov. They crept past the sentries. They carried bottles of gasoline and matches. The attack began. 3 houses erupted in flames. The fire spread quickly. Horses panicked in the stables. German soldiers scrambled out into the snow, disoriented and vulnerable. At first glance, a perfect sabotage operation, but in reality, a deadly trap. Zoya approached a 4th house to light the fuse, but the element of surprise was gone. She was spotted. German soldiers surrounded her before she could strike the match. There was no escape. The interrogation began immediately. It was not a conversation, it was torture. The captors stripped her naked. They beat her with belts until her skin broke. 200 lashes. The documents record that they used matches to burn parts of her body. She refused to speak. She gave no names. She gave no coordinates of her unit. The next morning, the soldiers dragged her to the village center. A wooden board hung around her neck. On it, a single word was scrawled: arsonist. Photographs from the archive show the scene, a makeshift gallows in the central square. The villagers were forced to gather and watch. Zoya stood on a crate. The noose was placed around her neck. Even then, she did not cry. Witnesses later testified she called out to the crowd, urging them to fight. The crate was kicked away. The Germans left her body hanging on display for weeks. It was a calculated move. They wanted to break the spirit of the local population. But the plan failed. Instead of fear, the execution sparked a wave of fury. Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya became a martyr. Her image became a symbol of unyielding resistance against the Nazi invasion. February 16, 1942. The Soviet government issued a decree. Zoya was posthumously named a hero of the Soviet Union. She was the first woman to receive this honor during the war. Her story did not end on the gallows. It became a weapon. 17 years old, that was her age at the moment of execution. Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya was a symbol, but the title of the youngest female hero of the Soviet Union belongs to another. Zinaida Portnova. She was a schoolgirl when the war broke out. In 1942, she joined the underground in Belarus. The group called themselves the Young Avengers. Her task was not child's play. She distributed propaganda leaflets. She stole weapons from sleeping guards. She monitored the movement of German columns and reported every tank to the partisans. Events accelerated. Older fighters taught the girl the craft of sabotage, how to set a timer, how to plant explosives. Portnova learned quickly. She participated in 3 major strikes. A gas depot burned down. A local power plant went dark. A brick factory turned to rubble. The documents confirm over 100 German soldiers died in these attacks. 1943. Portnova infiltrated the enemy garrison in Obol. Her cover was perfect, a kitchen assistant. She washed dishes and prepared soup. Then came the moment to strike. She poured poison into the huge food cauldrons. The Nazis began to die. Suspicion fell instantly on the new girl. The officer demanded she taste the food. Why did she agree? It seemed like suicide, but it was a calculated bluff. She ate the poisoned soup. The Germans watched closely. No immediate reaction followed. At first glance, she was innocent, but in reality, the poison was slowly working in her blood. They let her go. She did not return to the barracks. She fled to her grandmother's house. There, she drank liters of herbal whey. The vomiting was violent. She survived. But when she failed to show up for work the next day, the Germans understood everything. The hunt began. January 1944. The evasion lasted months, but luck ran out. Patrols caught her near the village of Goriani. The interrogation took place in a small office. The Gestapo officer felt safe. A teenage girl sat before him. He placed his pistol on the table and looked away. It was a fatal mistake. Portnova grabbed the weapon. One shot. The officer fell dead. 2 soldiers rushed in at the noise. Zinaida shot them both. She ran for the door. The chase was short. The reports described the scene, footprints leading to the riverbank. She tried to cross, but they cut her off. They dragged her back to the cell. This time, there was no mercy. The torture was brutal. They blinded her, they broke her fingers, but she remained silent. One morning, they took her to the forest edge. A single shot rang out. She was not yet 18. Justice came late. 14 years passed. In 1958, the decree was signed. Zinaida Portnova became a hero of the Soviet Union. Today, a monument stands in Minsk. Bronze features preserve her memory. The story cut off here. January 31st, 1943. One general chose treason over suicide. Why did a Prussian aristocrat agree to serve Stalin? It seemed impossible, but the frozen hell of Stalingrad broke his loyalty to the Reich. His name was Walter von Seydlitz Kurzbach, born August 22, 1888, Potsdam. He came from a bloodline of soldiers. The military was not just a career, it was his DNA. In 1908, he put on the uniform. He fought through the First World War. He survived the mud of the trenches and the artillery barrages on both fronts. He rose from lieutenant to captain. The Weimar Republic came and went, but Seydlitz remained. He climbed the ranks. Then the world burned again. 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Seydlitz was on the front lines. He commanded the 51st Army Corps. They pushed east, they won battles, but then they reached the Volga. The footage shows ruins of a city covered in ice and smoke, Stalingrad. Here, the German war machine stalled. General Friedrich Paulus led the Sixth Army. Seydlitz served under him. The fighting was house to house, room to room, but the trap snapped shut. The Red Army encircled the city. 300,000 men were cut off from supplies. At first glance, a temporary setback, but in reality, a tomb for the Sixth Army. Temperatures dropped to -30. Ammunition ran low. Men froze to death in their foxholes. Seydlitz saw the reality. He analyzed the maps. He realized the only option was a breakout. He went to Paulus. He demanded a retreat. "We must move or we die," he argued. But Paulus refused. He stared at the radio orders from Berlin. Hitler said, "Stand fast." Paulus obeyed. Seydlitz did not hide his rage. He openly criticized the strategy. He called it madness. But his protests hit a wall of blind obedience. Berlin sent a final message, January 30th, 1943. Hitler promoted Seydlitz to Field Marshal. It was not a reward. It was a loaded instruction. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. The promotion was an expectation. Commit suicide. Seydlitz looked at the pistol. Then he looked at his starving men. He made his choice. He didn't pull the trigger. He holstered the weapon and walked out with his hands up. The camera records, a long column of broken men marching into captivity. Events accelerated. Seydlitz did not go to a labor camp. He went to a microphone. He agreed to collaborate with the Soviets. Stalin's command saw an asset. They tasked him with a mission, turn the German army against Hitler. Other generals joined him, Helmut Schlemmer, Moritz von Dreber, Alexander Edler von Daniels. They sat in Moscow studios. Visual suggestion, the red light of a radio transmitter turns on. Seydlitz's voice crackled over the airwaves. He spoke to the troops on the front lines. He told them the war was lost. He told them to overthrow the madman in Berlin. The reaction in Germany was violent. The Nazi tribunal convened immediately. They stripped him of his citizenship. They sentenced him to death in absentia. His family felt the blow. They were removed from their jobs. They were marked as relatives of a traitor. But this was only the beginning. September 1943. Seydlitz took charge of the League of German Officers. He worked under the National Committee for a Free Germany. He wasn't satisfied with propaganda. He wanted action. He drafted a proposal. He placed it on the Soviet desks. His plan: take the German prisoners, give them rifles, create an anti-Nazi army to fight alongside the Soviets. He wanted to lead a communist guerrilla war into Germany. He waited for the order. But Stalin read the file and hesitated. He wanted voices, not soldiers. He did not trust armed Germans, even those who called themselves communists. The proposal was rejected. The files were archived. The army of prisoners never formed. His war ended in a cell. July of 1944. The bomb intended for Hitler exploded, but the dictator survived. This failure sealed General Seydlitz Kurzbach's fate. In Moscow, Soviet intelligence analyzed the reports. The conclusion was cold and pragmatic. Seydlitz's propaganda had failed to spark a revolt within the Wehrmacht. He was no longer useful. Stalin did not hesitate. He signed the order to dissolve the League of German Officers. The privileges vanished overnight. Seydlitz was stripped of his status. He was taken from his quarters and marched back to a cell. The heavy iron door slammed shut. He was no longer a political asset. He was just a prisoner again. 1945 arrived. The war ended. The Third Reich lay in ruins. But for Seydlitz, the ordeal intensified. The Soviet victors demanded his help with the occupation of Germany. They placed a contract on the table. Join the communist cause, assist the administration. He pushed the paper away. He refused. Why did he resist? He was a prisoner with no leverage, but his stance was rigid. He told his captors that his goal had been to save Germany from destruction, not to serve Soviet ideology. The refusal came with a price. The interrogations began. The charge was war crimes. In 1950, the court delivered its verdict: death. The execution squad was ready. But the Kremlin paused. The sentence was suddenly commuted. Instead of a bullet, he received 25 years in the camps. 14 years passed in total captivity. October 1956. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer negotiated with Moscow. The train cars filled with the last prisoners of war. Seydlitz was among them. The footage shows a gaunt, aged man stepping onto West German soil. He believed his suffering was over, but there was no hero's welcome. Seydlitz attempted to rebuild his existence. He filed legal motions to reclaim his family estates. He applied for the reinstatement of his military rank. He requested his pension. The West German government blocked him at every turn. He succeeded only in one narrow victory. The courts overturned the death sentence imposed on him by Hitler's regime in absentia. At first glance, he was a victim of two dictatorships, but in reality, he was a pariah to everyone. Former comrades shunned him. Men he had served with crossed the street to avoid his gaze. Generals like Manstein and Guderian published best-selling memoirs shaping the history of the war. Seydlitz remained silent. He wrote no books. He gave no interviews. He lived in the shadows. On April 28, 1976, he died in Bremen. Controversy followed him to the grave. Events accelerated nearly 2 decades later. The Soviet Union collapsed. In 1994, his descendants filed a petition in Moscow. They challenged the old files. The Russian prosecutor general's office reviewed the case. The verdict was clear. The 1950 conviction was illegal. The court annulled the charges. Posthumous rehabilitation was granted. Justice was served, but the recipient was no longer there to hear it. 140,000. That was the number of women standing ready in 1939. 50,000 sat at typewriters in administrative offices. 90,000 wore the uniforms of auxiliary support. They were the gears within the German machine. But the war had a voracious appetite. It demanded more bodies. By 1944, the ranks swelled to 300,000. The map of their deployment expanded rapidly. They did not stay within the borders of the Reich. They moved into the general government. They occupied the forests of Belarus and the coastal towns of France. They were stationed in Yugoslavia and Greece. 8,000 women managed the communications networks. 12,500 marched attached to the field army. But the Luftwaffe required the most hands. 130,000 women served the Air Force. The footage shows women in gray uniforms scanning the skies. They operated searchlights. As the bombing raids intensified, they manned the anti-aircraft batteries. Why did the policy fracture? The Nazi ideology dictated that a woman's place was in the home, but the desperate need for manpower crushed ideology. Initially, capturing a German woman on the front line was an anomaly, but the situation deteriorated. The regime's survival hung by a thread. In the final days, Hitler reversed his stance. He authorized the creation of an armed women's battalion. It was a move to bolster male morale. It was a signal that the end was near. Even the German Red Cross was pulled into the chaos. Nurses worked alongside soldiers. Theoretically, they were protected by the Geneva Convention. Practically, bullets did not discriminate. September 30th, 1944. A panic rippled through the high command. Soviet forces had captured female units in Romania. A new order was issued: evacuate all women under 21 from occupied territories immediately. Local commanders faced a brutal choice. They needed the skilled labor to free up men for the trenches, but they were personally responsible if the women were captured. The withdrawal was slow. The Soviet advance was fast. In the northern city of Pilsen, the Allies detained over 100 women. They were herded into barracks. To pass the time, they formed a choir known as the Pilsen Sparrows. They sang for the American Guards. At first glance, a peaceful detention, but in reality, a terrifying waiting room. Control of Pilsen shifted. The Americans handed the city to the Soviets. The atmosphere turned cold. Urgency gripped the camp. Screenings began. Most women were released, but the investigators checked every file. One communications assistant tried to blend in. It was a mistake. Her records identified her as a member of the SS. The soldiers detained her instantly. Fear paralyzed the remaining prisoners. Returning to the Soviet occupation zone was a nightmare scenario. In the internment camps, mercy was scarce. The camera records, piles of hair on the floor. It was common practice to shave the women's heads. Dignity was removed first. Then came the interrogations. 200 women died in those final weeks. They were not collateral damage. They were tortured. Interrogators demanded confessions regarding German war crimes. The methods were brutal. The goal was to break them before they died. But this was only the beginning of the horror. Those who were freed faced a bleak landscape. The Third Reich had collapsed, but the hatred remained. Reprisals began immediately. Soviet citizens remembered the siege of Leningrad. They remembered the starvation and the cold. Now they saw the enemy walking the streets. The violence was raw. Mobs formed quickly. Authorities often looked the other way. They smoked and watched. Women were stoned in public squares. Others were beaten to death by enraged civilians. There was no police protection. There was only vengeance. Records regarding the survivors are fragmented. It is assumed that by the end of 1948, the remaining internees had returned home. The camps emptied. The story cut off here. 33,771 lives. That was the death toll in just 2 days. The year was 1941. German forces swept across Ukraine, bringing a wave of brutal repression. The occupation was swift. It brought mass murder, the persecution of Jews, and the enslavement of prisoners. Only 10 days after the Wehrmacht seized Kiev, the city shook. Explosions tore through the German headquarters in the center. Smoke filled the streets. The Nazis needed a scapegoat. General Otto Rasch and his Einsatzgruppen death squads found one instantly. The explosions became a pretext for genocide. With support from the SS and local collaborators, the machine of extermination began to turn. Why did the population obey the orders? It seemed like a relocation, but the deception was absolute. Jewish residents were rounded up. The footage shows long columns of people walking with suitcases. Men, women, and children marched toward the city outskirts. Their destination was the Babi Yar ravine, located near a psychiatric hospital and a prison. The SS cleared the area methodically. They evacuated the hospital and murdered every patient inside. Events accelerated. At the ravine, the victims were forced to strip. They were handed shovels. They dug their own graves in the clay soil. Then, they were lined up on the edge. Between September 29th and 30th of 1941, the firing squads worked without pause. German forces slaughtered over 33,000 Ukrainian Jews in 48 hours. The ravine filled with bodies. Babi Yar became one of the war's most tragic episodes, but this was only the beginning. At first glance, the Ukrainian nationalists were useful allies to the Reich, but in reality, they were disposable tools. By late 1941, relations between Berlin and the local groups collapsed. The Germans arrested 600 of their former collaborators. They dragged them to the same ravine and executed them. Babi Yar became a common grave for both the victims and the perpetrators. The killing did not stop. As the months passed, thousands more were brought to the edge. Romani people, Soviet prisoners of war, civilians who opposed the regime. The Nazis enforced a system of total slavery. Millions of Ukrainians were forced into labor camps under inhumane conditions. Resistance was met with fire. Hundreds of villages were burned to the ground in retaliation. Summer of 1943. The front line shifted. Soviet artillery could be heard in the distance. The Germans panicked. They launched a secret operation to erase the evidence of their crimes. The camera records, thick black smoke rising from the ravine. Surviving prisoners were driven into the pit. Their task was gruesome. They were forced to exhume the rotting corpses from the mass graves. They built massive pyres and burned the bodies. The fire burned for weeks. Once the work was finished, the witnesses were silenced. The Nazis executed the prisoners who had participated in the cover-up. The exact number is lost to the flames. Estimates suggest that between 100,000 and 200,000 people were murdered at Babi Yar. Justice came slowly. Paul Blobel, the SS officer responsible for the atrocities, faced the Nuremberg tribunal. The verdict was death. In June of 1951, the executioner tightened the noose at Landsberg prison. This was no ordinary facility. It was the same prison where Adolf Hitler had been incarcerated following his failed Munich putsch, the place where he wrote Mein Kampf. Otto Rasch, the other architect of the massacre, never faced the hangman. He died in his cell in late 1948, consumed by illness. The file was closed. 1948. That was the year death finally caught him. He did not face a firing squad. He did not walk the steps to the gallows. Instead, He died behind bars in a prison cell due to failing health. A quiet end for a man responsible for loud atrocities. But for others, the reckoning was public. The Red Army pushed west and liberated Ukraine. The ground was still soaked in blood. Soviet authorities did not want just victory. They wanted retribution. The hunt for collaborators began immediately. Prosecutors prepared trials to punish local traitors and Nazi officials. The charges mirrored those at Nuremberg: the execution of civilians, the exploitation of forced labor, the total destruction of cities. Why did the Soviets choose the Kiev State Theater for the proceedings? It seemed like a venue for art, but the choice was calculated. It emphasized the sheer scale of the crimes. The courtroom was packed. Soviet prosecutors brought in boxes of evidence gathered after the liberation in 1944, intelligence reports, captured documents, maps of the camps. But the papers were not the strongest proof. The survivors were. The footage shows a witness stands at the podium pointing a trembling finger at the defendants. 15 Nazis stood in the dock. They were directly accused of the Babi Yar atrocities from September 29th and 30th, 1941. The testimony was grueling. There was no escape from the facts. 12 of the accused received the ultimate sentence: death. January 29th, 1946, Kiev's central square. The air was freezing. A massive crowd gathered to watch the finale. At first glance, a public gathering, but in reality, a ritual of vengeance. The camera records 12 gallows standing in a row against the gray winter sky. The trucks moved, the bodies dropped. The crowd watched in silence. These executions were not hidden. Soviet operators filmed every second on celluloid. They preserved the reels in deep archives. Decades later, these frames resurfaced. Ukrainian filmmaker Sergei Loznitsa used this exact footage in his documentary The Trial, released in 2022. The black and white images remain sharp today. But this was only a fraction of the truth. Justice was incomplete. Despite the public hangings, most direct perpetrators escaped. Thousands of German soldiers and Ukrainian auxiliaries participated in the Babi Yar massacres. They fled to the west. They melted back into civilian life. They died in their beds. This lack of accountability remains an open wound. The full scope of the terror was never fully addressed. It was Stalin's revenge. But for the victims, it was not enough. 5 million workers. That was the price Stalin demanded for the ruins of his empire. The devastation in the Soviet Union was absolute. Cities were reduced to craters. Factories were twisted metal. Reconstruction was not a matter of years. It was calculated to take decades. Stalin did not hide his intentions. For 2 years, he broadcast his plan in Moscow. The enemy would pay with sweat and blood. Why did the numbers keep rising? At the Tehran conference in late 1943, Stalin asked for 4 million forced laborers. He called it reparations. But by the summer of 1944, the appetite for revenge had grown. The demand increased to 5 million. The term was set at 10 years. He repeated this to the Allied powers without hesitation. December 16, 1944. The order came down. It was a total mobilization of human capital. Every German man aged 17 to 45 in liberated southeastern Europe was targeted. Every woman aged 18 to 30. If they could walk, they could work. They were to be shipped east. But this was only the beginning. The machinery of deportation moved fast. Within 2 months, 110,000 individuals were identified, loaded onto trains, and transported. Early in 1945, another 100,000 were pulled from occupied Germany. The camera records endless lines of prisoners tramping through the snow, guarded by soldiers with submachine guns. Most German prisoners of war held by the Soviets faced the same verdict. Exceptions were rare. Only the very young, the very old, or the critically ill were spared. About 100,000 in total. The rest were funneled into 60 holding camps across Poland and eastern Germany. These were not final destinations. They were processing centers. By the end of October 1945, the transport to the Soviet Union was complete. At first glance, a simple prison transfer. But in reality, a search for specific resources. Some prisoners were sent to Juchimov in Czechoslovakia. They did not build roads, they dug into the earth. Their task was to mine uranium for Stalin's nuclear program. Stalin initially claimed this slavery was temporary. He estimated a 15-year sentence for reconstruction. However, the timeline shifted. Most Axis prisoners were released between May 1945 and the end of 1949. This duration still far exceeded the detention periods of the Allied powers. But freedom was not for the healthy. The majority of those sent home were broken, elderly, ill, useless to the state. On June 6, 1945, the Kremlin tightened the leash. A new decree stated that any future release required direct Politburo approval. The Soviet secret police compiled their lists. 225,000 German and Austrian soldiers lay in camps and hospitals deemed unfit for work. Officers were excluded from this list. They remained valuable assets. The final statistic was staggering. In August of that year, a total of 708,055 prisoners were killed, 412,000 names. That was the count of German prisoners identified for immediate release. The reason was purely pragmatic. They were physically broken. What became of the remaining prisoners? The Soviet calculation was cold. The state wanted to expel those who could not work, saving food and resources. But fear lingered. Authorities refused to release anyone suspected of harboring anti-Soviet views. These men were detained under false pretexts. The files were stamped "hold," regardless of their health. Sergei Kruglov, the head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, drafted a brutal solution to maximize efficiency. He proposed shipping 150,000 invalids back to Germany. For those who remained, he offered a calculated incentive. He increased rations by 10%. This was not an act of mercy. It was an investment to boost productivity. The goal was to squeeze every ounce of labor from the captives. German accounts reveal the atmosphere within the 2,500 camps. It was a culture of absolute hunger. The scarcity inside the wire mirrored the ruin outside. The war had devastated the Soviet productive capacity. Civilians starved just as the prisoners did. But inside the camps, the situation degraded into primal survival. Dysentery swept through the barracks. Men hoarded crusts of bread in their bedding. Even in the face of starvation, some clung to food taboos, while others abandoned all dignity. The footage shows skeletal figures moving with slow, listless steps. Theft was common. Trading food became the only economy. Energy was the most precious currency, and no one wasted it on unnecessary movement. But this was only the beginning. Desperation pushed men to the edge. At first glance, tragic workplace accidents, but in reality, calculated self-destruction. Once the prisoners realized that the unfit were being repatriated, self-mutilation became a grim strategy. Reports flooded into the commandant's office. Men placed their hands on chopping blocks. They severed their own fingers with axes. Others took sharp objects to their eyes. They deliberately induced blindness to secure a ticket home. There was no turning back. Some resorted to subtler chemical methods. Prisoners consumed massive quantities of salt. They drank water until their bodies swelled with edema, mimicking severe kidney failure. It was a deadly gamble. Some succeeded and were loaded onto trains. Others collapsed and died on the concrete floors of the infirmary. This was the painful end of the war and the high price of Soviet revenge. The nightmare began long before the camps, right after the Battle of Stalingrad. Tens of thousands of German soldiers surrendered. They expected standard captivity. Instead, they faced an environment designed to kill. The camera records, columns of prisoners trudging through deep snow, surrounded by armed guards. Extreme cold froze their limbs. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs. The constant threat of execution hung over every step. The logistics of these death marches had a singular purpose: to break the will of the prisoners. Conditions were brutal, supplies were non-existent, physical exhaustion claimed thousands. Stragglers were shot where they fell. Many lives were extinguished before they even reached the camp gates. Those who survived the march found no relief. The labor camps offered only chronic malnutrition and endemic disease. The work was grueling. It broke even the strongest men. Rank offered no protection. High-ranking officers faced the same filth and deprivation. Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, commander of the 6th Army Corps. Karl Strecker, general of the 11th Army Corps. Their titles meant nothing here. Seydlitz-Kurzbach had distinguished himself through resilience during the battle. Now, his war was against a slow death, thus ended the illusion of honor. 1943. That was the year Strecker's war ended and his true nightmare began. He did not simply surrender. He was processed, stripped of his rank, and thrown into the Gulag system. He endured the same starvation, lice, and freezing temperatures as the thousands of anonymous soldiers beside him. But the Soviets wanted more than just forced labor. They wanted a public spectacle. The Kiev trial commenced. Historians often call it the Nuremberg of the East. High-ranking officers stood in the dock, answering for atrocities like the Babi Yar massacre. Why did Moscow broadcast every minute of these proceedings? It wasn't just about legal justice. It was a calculated propaganda move to cement the Soviet narrative of victory. The black and white footage shows stone-faced judges reading verdicts while thousands of locals gather in the city square to watch the hangings. For the ordinary soldiers, freedom came much later. Repatriation was a slow, painful train ride back to the West. They returned to a Germany that physically no longer existed. Cities were piles of brick, ash, and twisted metal. Families were displaced or dead. At first glance, a moment of relief, but in reality, a collision with a new, harsh world. The veterans returned with broken bodies and psychological fractures. They struggled to find work in a society that wanted to forget the war. There was no welcome parade, only the struggle for bread and a roof. This entire tragedy had a clear origin point: Stalingrad. It was the bloodiest battle in human history. The Wehrmacht lost its spine on the banks of the Volga. Logistics failed. Ammunition ran dry. Soldiers fought not for territory, but for a single tin of food. The defeat shattered the myth of German invincibility and opened the gates for the Soviet advance. Events accelerated. Field Marshal Paulus walked out of his basement headquarters with his hands up. He became the first marshal to surrender in German history. When the news reached Berlin, Hitler fell into a deep depression. He knew the truth. The road to the bunker began there. The Third Reich never recovered. The fall of Berlin in 1945 was merely the final echo of that winter. The mass graves in Russia remained silent, thus ended the ambition of an empire.